It's good to see you all together again. And we are now handing over to Amelia Glaser from UC of California at San Diego, who will chair the next session. The floor is yours, Amelia.
Welcome, everyone, to session 9 on 1905. I'll introduce both panelists first, and then we will let them take the floor. First, we have Professor Robert Weinberg of Swarthmore College. Professor Weinberg is professor of history at Swarthmore and has written on various aspects of Jewish question under czars and communists. And his many topics include ethnic violence and pogroms, the Soviet campaign against Judaism, ritual murder and the trial of Mendel Baylis, and the Birobidzhan experiment. And he'll be speaking about ethnic violence, politics, and revolution, the Odessa pogrom in October of 1905. Following Robert Weinberg's presentation, we will hear from Tetyana Yakovleva, Dr. Tetyana Yakovleva, who is an independent scholar currently, but was very recently a visiting PhD student at UC San Diego, in addition to finishing her work at Regensburg. Tetyana is a lecturer at the Yiddish Arts and Academics Association of North America, YANA, which is based here in San Diego, as well as at YIVO. She studied comparative literature, classical, and media studies at the universities of Kharkiv and Bari, and then received her PhD in Slavic and Jewish Studies from the University of Regensburg in 2019. She will be presenting second on Odessa 1905 in literature, violence, space, myth. So please, Robert.
Okay, and I prefer Bob, as you probably know. So anyway, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and thank the participants for stimulating and thought-provoking papers. And I want to thank everyone for your aptitude with English. You've spoiled so many Americans by being so willing to learn English. We simply don't deserve it. And finally, I want to apologize for my well-entrenched New York accent, and whatever difficulty it causes you, there's simply nothing I can do about it. Cosmopolitanism connotes tolerance of others, open-mindedness, inclusiveness, sophistication, and a sense of worldliness. Yet cosmopolitanism does not preclude harboring prejudices that all too frequently give rise to ethnic and religious violence. Indeed, such assaults often disrupt the cosmopolitan features of a city, and in the words of Caroline Humphrey, perforate its social fabric. The events in Odessa during 1905 demonstrate that ethnic prejudice and hostility coexisted with cosmopolitan values, with the latter no guarantee of peaceful and respectful relations among residents. In other words, the persistence of anti-Jewish prejudices, even in a bastion of urbane cosmopolitanism like Odessa, should not surprise us. Notwithstanding what others have told us about Odessa as the quintessential cosmopolitan center, we need to keep in mind that not all Odessans were cosmopolitan in demeanor, lifestyle, or attitudes. As in the case of earlier pogrom waves, the pogroms that occurred during Russia's first revolution of the 20th century took place in the context of political crisis and widespread social unrest. The pogroms of 1905 were considerably more violent, deadly, and destructive than those that occurred in the wake of Tsar Alexander II's assassination in 1881, but they did not reach the levels of bloodshed seen in the years between 1918 and 1920, when the collapse of state authority and the contending armies of the Russian Civil War resulted in the largest loss of Jewish life prior to World War II. In terms of death and destruction, the pogroms of 1905 were a way station between those of 1881 and 1918 and 1920, when rampaging soldiers engaged in unrestrained violence. In 1881-82, rioters targeted primarily property and shouted, "Beat the kikes." But in 1905, pogroms turned deadly as Gentiles threatened to kill Jews. By the time of the Civil War, some historians argue that the pogroms had devolved into ethnic cleansing and genocide. Nearly 700 pogroms broke out after Tsar Nicholas II issued the October Manifesto, which granted civil liberties, promised the establishment of popularly elected legislative assembly, and heralded the initial steps of political modernization in Russia. Throughout the Pale of Settlement, and even in towns and cities outside the Pale where Jews resided, pogromists destroyed thousands of homes and stores owned by Jews, wounded thousands, and murdered in cold blood approximately 1,000 persons. The deadliest and costliest pogrom occurred in Odessa, where thousands of Jews suffered at the hands of pogromists who rioted unchecked for several days before government forces restored law and order. In short, the question we must ask is why and how Gentiles in Odessa traveled the ugly road from apparent tolerance to barbarity. Time constraints do not allow me to address all the factors that led to a rampage of several days. Therefore, I will limit my remarks to situating pogrom in the context of the political crisis that came close to ending nearly 300 years of Romanov rule. What does the violence reveal about the social and political landscape that characterized Odessa in 1905? Why did the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the city fail to prevent the outbreak of the pogrom? That is, how do we explain its fragility of cosmopolitan Odessa during times of crisis? Examination of the pogrom in Odessa helps to illuminate the link between anti-Jewish violence and the social and political turmoil that characterized late imperial Russia in the early years of the 20th century. To be sure, the anti-Jewish unrest in 1905 stemmed in part from deep-rooted anti-Jewish animus, but anti-Semitic sentiments had to combine with certain social, political, and economic factors to spark violence. Ethnic conflict was rooted in a constellation of events, and its outbreak derived from a specific crisis besetting the autocracy in 1905. From my perspective, the attacks on Jews and their property that took place in the wake of political concessions granted by the Tsar in October 1905 marked the culmination of events that had been eroding autocratic power and authority since the beginning of the year. Essentially, the absence of a strong, confident state power created a vacuum in which extremists of all stripes had virtual free rein until government forces reasserted themselves. In 1905, the regime of Nicholas II found itself challenged by a series of events largely of its own making. The shooting of unarmed men, women, and children on Bloody Sunday sparked months of turmoil all over the empire. Workers, students, professionals, national minorities, revolutionaries, and liberals alike organized to demand political reform. The government responded to these calls for a constitution, civil rights, and political liberties with half-hearted overtures that radicalized the opposition forces and chipped away at the authority and power of the autocracy. By mid-October, a general strike paralyzed the country, prompting the Tsar to begrudgingly grant civil and political rights and promised formation of a properly elected legislative assembly. The issuance of the October Manifesto on the 17th of October set the stage for the pogroms that broke out as the opposing forces took to the streets to celebrate or decry the erosion of autocratic power. Supporters of the Tsar viewed Jews as responsible for the unrest that nearly toppled the autocracy and gave vent to their anger at this development by turning on Jewish Odessans. The pogroms were the expression of the crisis besetting the dynasty as the Tsarist government tried to stem the tide of revolution and its supporters mobilized to defend the autocracy that was under attack. Events in Odessa in 1905 hewed closely to the pattern that characterized developments on an empire-wide basis. Politics in Odessa became increasingly polarized during 1905 as anti- and pro-government forces coalesced and mobilized, thereby setting the stage for a confrontation between the forces of revolution and reaction. The pogrom occurred amidst the political rift that divided Odessa as militant monarchists and patriots demonstrated in support of the autocracy against the opposition posed by liberals, radicals, and revolutionaries, not all of whom were Jews. The pogrom occurred in the context of this unrest that propelled anti-Semitism, normally dormant and passive, into a paroxysm of bloodletting. The ethnic composition of Odessa helps to explain why the countrywide crisis turned violent and pitted Russians against Jews. The large number of Jews living in the city and their visible presence in the commercial and industrial life of the city contributed to resentment against Odessa's Jewish community. In the mid-19th century, Greek merchants found their control of the grain trade challenged by the emergence of Jewish competitors. This situation contributed to the outbreak of pogroms in 1859 and 1871, in which Greek residents attacked Jews and their property. But the decline of Greeks in the local economy and the rise of Russian-owned businesses by the last 2 decades of this century led to heightened tensions between Jews and Russians. For example, in the 1880s, firms owned by Jews controlled 70% of the export trade in grain, growing to over 90% by 1910. In addition, Jews and Russians not only lived in the same residential areas, but also shared working spaces in some case. As Patricia Hurley has written, Odessa did not have neighborhoods in the sense of ethnic and social self-graded residential areas. Not only did the rich and poor live in propinquity, but they drank side by side as well. For instance, Jews and Russians competed for work at the docks as stevedores and day laborers, but tended to be occupationally segregated in manufacturing enterprises, whether they were workshops or small factories. Already predisposed to dislike Jews due to well-entrenched anti-Semitism in late imperial Russian society, Russians, Ukrainians, and other Gentiles in Odessa seized upon the Jews' economic role in the city to accuse them of exploiting non-Jews. This popular belief that Jewish capitalists exploited Russians had less basis in reality, however, than was commonly assumed. The preponderance of wealth in Odessa, not to mention political influence and power, remained in the hands of non-Jews, who controlled half of all large commercial enterprises and brokerage firms in most factories. The vast majorities of Jews eked out meager livings as shopkeepers, secondhand dealers, sales clerks, petty traders, domestic servants, day laborers, and workshop employees. Despite the disparity between popular perception and the reality of Jewish wealth and power, Jews found it difficult to dispel this attitude that especially rang true during the recession that gripped the country after 1900. Along with accusations of economic exploitation, the populace and city authorities tended to associate civil unrest and political opposition with Jews, a word synonymous with revolutionaries in certain circles. The emergence of sustained labor unrest for most of 1905 and the accusation by right-wing agitators that Jews were responsible for the political crisis gripping the country led to heightened tension between Jews and Russians. While many reports of Jewish revolutionary activity were exaggerations or even fabrications, Jews were indeed behind some of the social and political ferment enveloping Odessa. During the summer, the police arrested a group of Jewish revolutionaries, for example, for making and stockpiling bombs. Radical Jewish students organized rallies at the university and directed student strikes and public demonstrations. Jewish students, youths, and workers also filled the ranks of the crowds that attended rallies at the university in September and October. In short, Jews actively participated in the work stoppages, demonstrations, and street disorders that overwhelmed Odessa by the time the general strike in mid-October brought the country to a standstill. Moreover, Jewish youths joined forces with revolutionary parties to organize self-defense units designed to protect the Jewish community. Such preparations saved Jewish lives and protected Jewish property, but they also reinforced the perception of Jews as revolutionaries and instigators of trouble. These events confirmed many high-ranking police and their other officials' belief that Jews were a seditious element. Government officials in Odessa had a long history of blaming Jews for fomenting trouble in the city. This situation signaled to anti-Semites that the authorities in Odessa sympathized with anti-Jewish agitation, combined with economic resentments and frustrations, as well as religious or ethnic prejudices. The belief that Jews were revolutionaries helped create an explosive situation. To those residents of Odessa alarmed by the opposition to the regime, Jews were convenient targets for retaliation. In Odessa, pogromist behavior had both an ethnic and a class basis that reflected the interplay of long-term ethnic antagonism, the structure of Odessa's economy, and short-term political catalysts. Jewish merchants' domination of the grain trade predeceived many day laborers and dock workers who comprised a large segment of the pogromist mobs against Jews, whom they conveniently saw as the source of economic ills besetting the city. In addition, competition with Jews for scarce jobs made the situation combustible and ripe for anti-Jewish violence. Without taking into account the hostile anti-Jewish atmosphere in Odessa, we can't understand why Russian workers during times of economic distress chose not to attack other Russian workers who competed with them for scarce jobs, or Russian employers, but instead indiscriminately lashed out at all Jews, regardless of whether they were job competitors or potential employers. Ethnic and socioeconomic problems alone do not explain why Russian day workers decided to attack Jews in October 1905. After all, in June, a general strike devolved into the mass shooting of Jews and non-Jews alike who had gathered in the port to celebrate the mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. In June, Odessans of all stripes supported anti-government forces. But anti-Jewish violence only broke out in October, even though economic circumstances were not much different from what they were in early summer. In June, Russian dock workers and day laborers who comprised the bulk of Odessans involved in the unrest exploded in a fit of rage, but chose to challenge constituted authority by destroying the harbor after they broke into the warehouses where all the wine and vodka was stored. In October, however, these workers turned their sights on to Jews, although material conditions had not substantially changed. Not all pogromists were workers, but evidence suggests that the overwhelming number of them were Russian dock workers, day laborers, and unskilled factory workers. That is the same people who rioted in June. They were presumably the least cosmopolitan of residents of Odessa and did not have to jettison the cosmopolitan skin when they attacked Jews. So how do we explain this shift? What had changed since the June disorders was the political atmosphere, namely the issuance of the October Manifesto, which demonstrated the desperate efforts of the autocracy to pacify the populace and hold on to power. The granting of civil and political liberties served as the catalyst that led to the explosion of violence. Ilya Gerasimov is certainly correct when he notes that ideology does not account for the behavior of all pogromists. Not all the people who trashed Jewish homes, looted Jewish stores, and harmed Jews were motivated by opposition to the October Manifesto. Many Russian workers, day laborers, dock workers in particular, were perhaps less motivated by politics than by the opportunity to vent some frustration and vandalize stores and homes. Certainly not all members of the processions supporting the regime and participants in the pogrom represented the extreme right of the political spectrum, as the dock workers and day laborers' riot in June suggests. For them, the struggle between revolution and reaction, which inspired the more politically conscious, played a secondary role. Yet explanations of the pogrom have to take into account the prevailing political climate in which opponents and defenders of the regime literally met on the streets of Odessa after the announcement of the October Manifesto. Crowds thronged the streets of central Odessa to participate in patriotic processions and to express support of the autocracy or to celebrate the granting political reforms. These street demonstrations led to violent confrontations that degenerate into pogrom when the supporters of Nicholas II began attacking Jews indiscriminately. Many pogromists may not have intended to assault the Jews and destroy their property, but they were provoked by the shooting and bomb throwing of the revolutionaries and self-defense brigades, though it is not clear which side first opened fire. Those actions helped explain the intensity of the pogromists' attacks on their victims, whatever the specific motivations of the various individuals in the pogrom. Popular and official anti-Semitism combined with depressed economic circumstances to provide the necessary psychological and material preconditions, while the political climate of 1905 helped trigger the pogrom. Matters were made worse by the public comments of the city governor and military commander who expressed their sympathies for the supporters of autocracy. And the fact that the police abandoned their posts and warded back to the precincts sent a message that the authorities were going to allow the forces of reaction to confront the opponents of the regime without official interference. In other words, local authorities seemed to sanction violence, especially because they did nothing for several days to stem the violence and unrest. By no means did all Gentile workers participate or even sympathize with the bloodletting. Many Russian factories enlisted in self-defense units that patrolled the city, while others sheltered their Jewish neighbors and friends during the terror. After the pogrom, Russians who had defended Jews provided financial aid to pogrom victims and took vigorous action to punish pogromists and assure that another pogrom would not occur. The reluctance of these Russian factory workers to join ranks with pogromists can be attributed in part to the fact that they did not compete with Jews for jobs. They rarely worked in the same factories and workshops as Russians, that is, the Jews who were attacked. In fact, Jews and Russians were generally not employed in the same branch of manufacturing, and unlike dock workers and day laborers, Jews and Gentiles were thus not in direct competition for employment. The pogrom served the cause of political reaction by revealing how a potentially revolutionary situation could quickly become diffused when the target of the people's wrath shifted from the autocracy to the Jews, a convenient scapegoat viewed as responsible for personal difficulties and political uncertainty. The wave of pogroms that broke out in mid-October throughout the country would not have occurred without the polarized political atmosphere that had developed in 1905. The issuance of the manifesto and the mobilization of anti-Tsarist and monarchist forces in such an emotionally charged setting triggered the outbreak of bloodletting at a time of political anxiety. Anti-Jewish violence was part of the arsenal of conservative forces who rejected cosmopolitanism's embrace of cultural tolerance and diversity. In 1905, speakers at meetings hosted by anti-Semitic organizations denounced cosmopolitanism and other socialist teachings, and that's a quote, as the bedfellows of political subversion. The pogrom assumed the characteristics of a secular ritual, whereby some pogromists hoped to celebrate and reinforce identity as Orthodox Christians devoted to Tsar and motherland. From their perspective, the challenges confronting the autocracy threatened to unravel the religious bonds that tied them to the Tsar. The destruction of portraits of Nicholas II, a symbolic offense akin to the destruction of an icon, elicited feelings of resentment and anger and helped to mobilize the forces of reaction eager to stand up to the provocative behavior of those rejecting the values that undergirded the autocracy. The pogromists can be viewed as striving to strengthen the foundation of Tsarist rule by physically attacking the regime's existential enemy, the Jew, in the hope of destroying all perceived threats to autocratic institutions and values. Like the pogrom wave that targeted Jews as responsible for the regicide in 1881, some pogromists in 1905 viewed Jews as threats to the body politic and the fabric of late imperial Russian society, and turned to violence to preserve the old regime. Pogroms diverted the attention and energy of opposition forces across the empire, although workers in major cities such as Odessa, Kiev, St. Petersburg, and Moscow continued to challenge the government of Nicholas II. The violence and bloodshed benefited the regime, which was able to group and reassert its authority and control of society. And I will finish there. Anyway, thank you for listening. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Bob, you finished exactly on time. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I wanted to just quickly remind everyone to please go ahead and put questions into the chat. I can also call upon you if you say I have a question in the chat. And we will now hear from Tetyana.
Thank you. Good evening from Kharkov in Ukraine, and thank you very much for organizing this event, Professor Lecky and Professor Zicher, and especially to have a chance personally to say thank Robert Weinberg for his work, because it has been my Bible in the first years of a PhD student life in order to understand what was going on in 1905. So today's paper is the summary of my dissertation, Odessa 1905 in Literature, Violence, Space, Myth. Over the course of its history, Odessa changed from a peripheral geographical place on the edge of the Russian Empire to one of the main Jewish cultural centers at the end of the 19th century. The cultural historical myth of Odessa, represented in various literary texts, intensifies after 1905 as a result of the revolution and the anti-Jewish pogrom of the year. The texts analyzed in the present paper indicate that this year divided the cultural history of the city into two periods, before and after 1905. Before the period of upheaval, Odessa myth was part of a lively Jewish life. It was famous for its economic success, freedom, and cosmopolitanism. Famous literary texts from Russian literature, just to name some: Onegin's Journey from Yevgeny Onegin by Alexander Pushkin, from Ukrainian literature Nad Chornym Morem, About the Black Sea by Ivan Nechulevitsky, from Russian Jewish literature, The Story of how Reb Chaim Fagis traveled from Kishinev to Odessa by Osip Rabinovich, and from Yiddish classics, Fischke der Krummer, Fischke Bolaim, by Mendele Moicher Sforim, and Menachem Mendel by Shalom Aleichem, the first chapter from Odessa about London. After 1905, Odessa myth shifts mostly to its underworld and its glorious past and starts to flourish without existing and real Jewish spaces, remaining only in memory spaces. The new Odessa myth arises as a reaction to violence and is connected with the decline of the Jewish cultural life after 1905 and the subsequent economic crisis. Literary examples: The 12 Chairs by Ilifan Petrov, The Odessa Tales by Isaac Babel, Kornei Chukovsky, Lazar Karman, Vladimir Zhabotinsky, Semyon Yushkevich, David Eisman, and Alexander Kippen witnessed the events of 1905 and conveyed in their texts the violent atmosphere of that year. These authors can be assigned to the so-called Russian Jewish literature, which has its beginning and the end in Odessa. The theoretical analysis is based on three space theory approaches: social spaces of Georg Simmel, mythical spaces of Ernst Cassirer, and city semiotic of Yuri Lotman. These concepts allow us to determine social, mythical, and symbolic spaces in the city and to analyze them in the literary text. Analysis of the Potemkin text reveals the famous boulevard staircase of Odessa as a boundary line and as a semiosphere, which separates the center from the periphery and which is almost deserted. Only in the film Bronenосец Potemkin, Battleship Potemkin by the Soviet film director Sergei Eisenstein, the staircase is full of people. For the film, as a new visual medium of the time, Eisenstein used a pictorial and expressive perspective that enables both panorama and over-the-shoulder shot camera angles to show the most important urban spaces, the center, with the monument of the Duc de Richelieu, and the harbor. The stairs are well suited for this. In addition, the staircase illustrates the monarchy's violence against the houseless working class, which in reality does not take place on the stairs, but in the harbor. For Lenin and the socialist movements before the October Revolution of 1917, the day of the arrival of Potemkin is associated with defeat because there was no revolutionary agreement between the armored battleship and the city. Only after 1924 is the 1905 revolution celebrated as a victorious event. The film from 1925 is part of this propaganda. In 1955, on the 50th anniversary of the mutiny related to the film, the staircase was renamed Potemkin Stairs, which we have now. In addition to the motif of the stairs, all the texts analyzed have in common the symbolic integration of the four basic elements of water and fire, air and earth. There is the Black Sea, the fire of the machine gun, and the fire in the harbor, the earth of the city of Odessa, and the air, symbolizing the fate of the Jews as an ever-wandering people, Luftmenschen. In his sketch, 1905 June, Chukovsky reports on a certain day when the inhabitants of Odessa learned of the stay of the revolutionary armored battleship Knyaz Potemkin Tavrechesky in its port. The atmosphere of the day is presented from the perspective of a cross-border narrator and is based on the mythical binary division of the world, happy because of revolutionary hope at the beginning of the day and sad with horror at the end of the day. This dichotomy arises from the violence in the harbor, the vagabond violence of the drunken crowd, and the order-creating violence of the soldiers, achieved with machine guns. In addition, symbolic upper versus lower Odessa, social, the rich population from the center versus the poor population from Perisic, and sensual, revolutionary versus non-revolutionary modes, urban spaces are combined with violence. The chronological narration and the fact that it belongs to the sketch in Russian Ocherb genre give the text strong flexographic features. Whereas Chukovsky describes only one day in his Ocherb, in Carmen's story Potemkinskие дни, разгром старого порта, all 3 days, from June 14th to 17th, are presented. The narrative takes the perspective of a resident of the city periphery who never crosses the border between the city and the port. The message of the story is based on the mythical binary division of the world into old protagonists, old port, old customs, and new young dock workers, new port, new political order. As in Chukovsky's sketch 1905, this dichotomy is presented by the violence in the port. Here too, social bourgeoisie from the center and barefoot from the port, and symbolic native and foreign, familiar and dangerous urban spaces playing an important role in the development and representation of violence. Flashbacks playing an important role in anachronic narration, the past of Odessa or its port before 1905, as the time before the catastrophe, is reconstructed through memories of the poor Jewish port worker, Dikari, Odessa slang, Krisa. It provides a unique opportunity to learn about the urban spaces from the perspective of the port workers. The destruction of the port becomes a turning point in the city's history. On the one hand, the fire is the harbinger of the new socialist order. On the other hand, it leads to an economic crisis. In his novel Tetyana, Zhabotinsky depicts almost 5 years of Odessa history from 1902 to 1907 from the perspective of a journalist, which focuses on the assimilated wealthy Jewish migrant families. Here too, the day of the arrival of the armored battleship on June 15 plays a major role. It becomes the turning point in the structure of the whole novel and in the fate of the protagonist, and thus in the history of the city. The mythical binary division is realized here in the novel through the pair of opposites, native and foreign, or Jewish, non-Jewish, which is fundamentally based on the personal spaces of the protagonist. These strongly mythologized personal spaces in turn generate urban spaces in which the characters move and which are linked to religion as a form of the cultural symbolic system. In the novel, as in the works of Carmen and Chukovsky, the space of the rich in the center contrasts with the space of the poor in the periphery. In doing so, Zhabotinsky extends the peripheral districts, Port and Perisic, by adding the districts of Moldovanka and Slobodka-Romanovka. As in the previous text, violence in the city is linked to the armored battleship and the subsequent wave of anti-Semitism and revolution. The arrival of the battleship changes the cultural significance of the port and transforms it, the place of the social and geographical periphery, into the center of historical events. The novel is designed to be retrospective and the nostalgic memory. Tetyana explicitly mentions and shows how the year 1905 changed the history of the city. Keeping writing his story of October, to give a chronological representation of the events in October during the workers' strike, the manifesto, and the pogrom from October 16 to 22nd. This is why his work is often also called the sketch Ocherb. While the armored battleship was associated with the revolution in the previous work, it is represented by the university. In this story, the mythical binary division into one's native and foreign, Jewish and non-Jewish, plays a major role too. All revolutionary spaces that lead peripheral city dwellers to the center are connected to the pogrom spaces, which in turn bring central city dwellers to the periphery, such as Slobodka and Zastava, with urban violence. Yushkevich's three short stories, Prikladbishe, Otche Nashi, and Panorama, describe the fate of Jewish families shortly after the pogrom. In all three stories, the street is equated with the city that brought death and misfortune to Jewish families with the pogrom. The geographical spaces indicate the periphery of Odessa where the events take place. After the pogrom, the street as a geographical place takes the characteristics of an uncomfortable space and the sociological and semiotic boundary separating the Jewish from the non-Jewish and the poor from the rich. The religious spaces in Yushkevich's text are connected to the apocalyptic messianic ideas of the final judgment and are based on mythical thinking and the basic oppositions derived from it, holy and profane, good and bad. While in Prikladbishe, the main motive is the cemetery, the city of peace, or place of peace. Reference here could be found in Yiddish literature, Teute Stadt by Yitzhak Leiber Spirit, Dead City, or in Der Teute Stadt by Lamed Shapira in the Dead City. In Otche Nash, the motive of forgiveness is dominant. Panorama addresses the transience of being, Jewish quietism and messianic prophecies of a future time and new people. In all three works, the figures create symbolic utopian spaces in order to escape the violent social and religious spaces. In the last story we talk about today, in his short story Serce Bitiya, Eisman tells of the fate of a victim and perpetrator of the pogrom almost a year after the event. We have the view of perpetrator like in Lamed Shapira's story Der Kreuz, the cross. The author places both characters in the closed social urban space of the hospital. Just as in other pogrom texts, a mythical binary opposition arises here, native and foreign, and thus Jewish and non-Jewish. In addition, Eisman and Keaton show the binary opposition of permitted with forbidden, which goes back to the mythical pair of opposites of sacred and profane. It manifests itself in the use of violence against the defenseless Jewish people. Religious and symbolic spaces are in the foreground and appear in madness in the victimization and in hallucinations in the perpetrator of Luke. The analysis of the pogrom text reveals the street as an important open space that takes on violent traits with the pogrom. The street is understood as a semiotic border that separates the center and the periphery, victims and perpetrators, and at the same time connects them. The street reflects the atmosphere of the whole city. In the portrayal of violence, Jewish passivity in Yushkevich contrasts with the self-defense groups in Kitten. Odessa 1905, following Michel de Certeau, is a network of moving elements and the result of activities. The center-periphery model does not remain permanent, but changes through the effects of violence, both during the revolution and during the pogrom. Physical places in Odessa transform in 1905, and the historical events give them a different cultural meaning, such as the port during the arrival of the armored battleship, the university during the revolution, or the streets after the pogrom. Urban spaces such as the boulevard staircase and the street can generally be viewed as boundary lines and semiospheres. The inner border areas, in the sense of simile, highlight the Jewish hospital, the university, the coffee house, or the tavern as important social and symbolic urban spaces. In addition, a basement presents itself as a social and symbolic space that can be compared with the underworld and exists as a motif in Russian literature. For example, on Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, Korolenko's In a Bad Society, Leonid Andreev's In the Basement, and in Maxim Gorky's Underground, Nadnia. The opposition Jewish versus non-Jewish dominates in the pogrom text. This can be explained by the fact that at the beginning of 1905, with the arrival of the armored battleship and the manifesto, people still believed in the social equality without ethnic differences and in common future for Slavs, Russians, Ukrainians, and Jews. At the end of 1905, with the anti-Semitic propaganda in September and after the pogrom in October, optimistic future prospect went into a crisis. In all of the works analyzed, the figures create symbolic spaces that function as alternatives and paths of escape from violent social and religious spaces. All authors start out as publicists, and that's probably why the line between factual and fictional writing is so flexible in their works. What all authors have in common is that they are influenced by Gorky and Russian realism. Also, each individual text contains characteristic features of this literary epoch. It also shows features and prototypes of other literary epochs. In addition to realism, the works of Russian Jewish authors analyzed are influenced by French and Russian symbolism, the Jewish Haskalah Renaissance, and antiquity, in which both biblical texts and texts from Greek and later Roman myths arise. At the same time, all authors write in the tradition of Jewish reactions to catastrophe. In his fundamental work against the apocalypse, David Roskis defines what he calls the Jewish dialectical reaction to the catastrophe. The greater the immediate destruction, the more it was made to recall the ancient archetypes. So every catastrophe that befell the Jews was fixed in the mythical past. This was revived as a way of expressing the horror. In each generation, the Jews continuously compared the catastrophe of their time with various biblical episodes, thus establishing the certainty that their misfortune was part of the divine plan. That always brings the concept of salvation into history. Jabotinsky compares Odessa with the biblical city of Babel, a tornado of place where every corner of local life used somehow to get entangled with affairs and questions of a worldwide range. Similar to Babel, Odessa was experiencing an economic boom and is characterized by different languages. Similar to Babel, Jewish culture in Odessa was in danger. The explosive political situation then and now calls for a focus on the common Jewish, Russian, Ukrainian cultural heritage in Odessa. The violence of 1905 radically changed the history of the city and its inhabitants. From a multi-ethnic metropolis and the Jewish cultural center, Odessa is transformed into an average Soviet and later Ukrainian, primarily Russian-speaking city. But the culture of remembrance opposes forgetting, that reconstructs and updates evidence of the past and thus makes it effective in new context. Odessa is characterized by the ambivalence of forgetting and remembering. The city lives to this day with a melancholy feeling of its past and is strongly shaped by its myths. The text by Tchaikovsky, Karina, Jabotinsky, Yushkevich, Eichmann, and Keaton keep the memory alive and offer valuable, literally formed perspectives on a key event in our history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Also for staying perfectly within time. We have time for questions. You can go ahead and put those in the chat, either by writing a question in or by writing, your name, or if you'd like to just go ahead and raise your hand, that works too. Either your hand or your yellow hand. And I'm happy to open with a question because these talks have provoked many for me. I wanted to just ask Bob a little bit more about the ideology of the dock workers. Because this part of your talk is so interesting to me, the movement between revolutionary excitement, crowd excitement, and a pogrom. And this can just flick, right? And yet you see dock workers involved in pogroms in various places, not only in Odessa, you also see it along the rivers and so forth. Gorky's written about it. So I'm wondering about their ideology. What were they reading? Yeah. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. I have no idea what they were reading. I can't imagine they were very literate. And I'm not sure I would attribute any specific ideology to them. I think they were caught up with the times and the political currents of the time. And as I think occurred in June, they were quite willing not to attack Jews. The Jews weren't seen as the enemy, but they were in October. And I think it was just because there's a larger political context in which there are people with political ideologies trying to encourage people to behave a certain way. And imagine in the time, if you were in Odessa October 18th, the day after the manifesto was announced, you might just get quite easily caught up with what was happening on the streets. And if you think somebody's attacking you, you may lash out at who you perceive. I can think back, and I know Ilya made this comment yesterday about the riots last summer in Chicago. I live in downtown Philadelphia, and I recall after there was a demonstration protesting the murder of George Floyd, and people ended up walking up our street, people who'd been protesting at City Hall, and they walked up our street, and which is lined with all sorts of stores, and all of a sudden they started looting, right? And then people, when this became known, people joined them, came from other parts of the city to join in the looting. So the street I lived on was essentially all the stores in the ground floors were trashed. I don't think these people necessarily set out to do that. I don't think necessarily many of them had any political motivation. They just saw an opportunity to grab things and participate. They may have been very angry over what happened to George Floyd, but I'm not sure there was any real political motivation. Others did. I think the people that were protesting and marching at first, but crowds grow, and I think they become very hard to understand the dynamics of what this kind of rioting, what precipitates this kind of rioting. I don't know if that answers everything you were looking for.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's that crowd itself. What you're talking about in terms of the pogrom mob is, I find really, really fascinating. What happens? How does something turn into a pogrom?
I don't understand how you wake up one day and decide that you're going to attack and kill your neighbor who just happens to be Jewish, but for many years you got along with that person. Something triggers that, and something allows that to happen.
I want to call upon Scott, who has his yellow hand raised, and others, please go ahead and raise your hands. I'm just making a list.
Great. So thanks so much to Bob. Here's my copy of Bob's great book, Blood on the Steps. And I wanted to, which I've read many times, and it actually holds together, a great book, fantastic book, it influenced a lot of us. I'm wondering if we could bring these two talks together a little bit and maybe start with Bob, and maybe you could talk about the pogrom of Odessa, or the pogroms as myth, and how the pogrom of Odessa developed into a myth, and how that myth intersected with different historical works, and then how you as a historian in the later part of the 20th century, early 21st century, had to kind of distill between myth and historical fact when working on historical work about what has turned into a larger myth of history. So you can kind of look at the mythical aspects of the pogrom and then how you dealt with that in your own work.
That's a good question. A lot of it is you have to look at the sources you read and decide how accurate. I mean, and I think, as John Clear wrote about, and when it comes to 1881 pogroms throughout the empire, there are certain stories that get told and put down into print and then are accepted by historians and other observers later on. So you may have these stories of mass rapes or other events that may not have occurred, but someone, a journalist perhaps, maybe a local observer, writes about it as thinking that it did happen, and then others will look at those sources because it's a primary source, let's say, and not be able to unravel what goes into the creation of that story. So I'm never quite sure, and when I think about it, I haven't been really doing any investigation of the pogrom since I wrote that book. And just when you show me the book, every time I look at the book for something, I'm going, gee, I don't recall writing this at all. This may be a common experience for everybody who's written books. When you look back at it, I don't remember writing that paragraph, but I guess I did, and it's not so bad. But having said that, it's really hard to know how to unravel the truth from the myth. And I think you do create, and myths do, especially about Odessa, right? The myth about cosmopolitan Odessa and Jewish Odessa, there's always an element of truth to it. But it may get fleshed out and elaborated and exaggerated. And, that's the hardest thing to deal with when you're a historian or a literary scholar. How does that compare to the reality of it? And sometimes we just may never really know because you're dependent upon what people have written or said.
I'm going to read a question from Svetlana Netkovich to Tetyana. This is about the association of the Potemkin event, which didn't end up ending in a pogrom, with the October pogrom in literature. Tetyana, do you have any idea why what the association is between these events? And Svetlana, if you'd like to augment that question, please go ahead.
Yeah, it follows from our last year conversation when we saw that in many literary works, especially in Jabotinsky, he didn't show the pogrom. He shows only Potemkin event as a harbinger of the pogrom, and associates it as with pogroms, although it was not. So it's interesting, and through the material that Amelia brought, we saw that he's not unique in this. The other authors did it as well. So do you have any idea why those events were so connected?
I try to repeat. So there are two questions: why we don't have so many literary adaptations of the pogrom events of the Potemkin days, and which are not connected. The pogrom.
No, this is not about literary adaptation. On the contrary, they conflate these events. Sometimes, like in Jabotinsky, there is no difference. For him, Potemkin event is just a harbinger or foreshadowing the pogrom, although they are not connected directly.
No, they are connected. Well, in Robert Weinberg's book, it's clear and it helps understand these events. That's why I have also in my dissertation three authors describing the Potemkin days, and three authors, small works, different short stories describing the pogrom days, because they are very, very much connected. And for example, Lazar Carmen, he describes the pogrom in Port, and it's again, I will repeat what Robert Weinberg said, that it's important the sources you read and who is creating the writing and the myth itself, because with every writing, even if it's historical, there is also a chance of some myth, some creativeness in it. And I try to choose the authors who witnessed the event, and also they show their perspective. So Jabotinsky, he was probably with Chukovsky in the Hotel London in the upper side. That's why he didn't describe very detailed the events in the port. But they knew what was going on because Carmen was there and they were all connected. They were close friends. They all worked together before, so like two years before. The same with the program text in October. The writers, for example, as Isaac Babel, who write about the Historia Marie Golubyatin, also about 1905 pogrom. And it seems to be Odessa, but actually he was in Nikolaev at this time. And so he's creating a myth, and it's again difficult to define, and probably we should accept this line, not a strong line between the photographical and the fictional text, but they are very much connected. If I answered your question, let me know how can I better answer this.
Other questions? Those are all the questions that I had in my queue, but I welcome other people to just go ahead and raise your hand and unmute yourselves. And panelists, please feel free to ask questions of one another.
I just have a question about the Jabotinsky story that you read last year as part of the seminar. Which one was that?
Do you ask me?
Whoever was reading it.
We refer to the 5, but the 5 describes only Potemkin event.
That's right.
I know for sure that during the pogrom, Jabotinsky was in Switzerland. So, but in his later play Chuzbina, the foreign land, he again conflates the events. He presents a kind of mix of some narrative mix of Potemkin event and pogrom. Like he presents them in a way as one of the same event, which is, as we learned, as I understand, Potemkin event was not so much associated with anti-Jewish violence.
Not at all. Too bad Brian's not here. He could perhaps, maybe Scott knows.
I think he is here.
Brian's here?
Brian is everywhere.
Brian is everywhere. Brian, do you want to unmute yourself and weigh in? Or
Until he does, let me just say this is something which we might think about Sveta and Bob and other people, that Jabotinsky is looking at pogroms as part of a revolution and counter-revolutionary violence, and not as a specifically anti-Jewish act like Bialik saw Kishinev in 1903. And so I think this comes up in Bob's talk and also in the talk of literature, that for many, and perhaps in Jabotinsky, it's still part of a revolution and counter-revolution, and not part of a specific anti-Jewish or Zionist narrative that we see in most particularly in Kishinev and Bialik and Zipperstein's most recent book. So that's my take on it, but you can disagree.
No, but maybe Tetyana can elaborate about the ways Carmen and Chukovsky represented. Do their representation of Potemkin event is connected to anti-Jewish violence, or they are dissociated?
Well, exactly, Carmen and Chukovsky, they don't have strong these Jewish and non-Jewish spaces. They don't separate them very much. But in the works of Kippen, when he describes about the pogrom, we know that there were anti-Jewish propaganda already in September, telling that the city was in the crisis after the port disaster, right? So the people had no job. The city was in the for 2 months almost without functional activities, and of course a lot of especially poor people were angry, and there were just these leaflets that we have to restore order because Jews were guilty in this port disaster, because a lot of Jews, like in Chuzbina, we can see, Jabotinsky described it very well, a lot of Jewish speakers were active during this revolutionary upheaval in June. And that's why it's very much connected. Well, connected in this case of moving the mob, and it was how mob was ruled.
So
in fact, they are maybe not so connected. Well, yes, it's a difficult question, but it's how it describes in the literary work, and that's also how I understand from Robert Weinberg's book.
Thank you both so much. I wish we could continue to talk about this because I think we have lots of fruitful discussion going on, but I've been reminded that we actually have to take a short break before the next panel, which as a future panelist will be good. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking both Bob and Tanya for these really provocative discussions.
And also thank you, Amelia, for chairing this session. In our program, we don't have a break, but Ephraim and I agreed that we should have 4 to 5 minutes, just very quickly before we go into our roundtable discussion about cosmopolitanism. Thank you very much so far. See you in 4 to 5 minutes.
I'm going to share my screen for a very brief musical interlude. And if Odessa is very important in Russian song, like Nef, it is also in Yiddish song. So enjoy.
Okay, it looks like we are already reassembled. Our roundtable participants, Guido, Amelia, Abel, and chair and discussant Scott Urey. Everybody's there? What did you say?
Discussant, I'll chair. I don't know. Anyways.
Yeah,
discuss it. Okay, I'll discuss. Let there be
apparently
discussion.
I mixed something up. Well, whatever your role will be, I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. And please take over, Scott.
Well, momentarily, of course. First of all, thank you so much to Ephraim and for Miriam for putting together what is such a great virtual conference the past few days. A lot of great talks and presentations from people all over our crazy planet. We're going to have, what is it, Ephraim? A 1 hour conversation, 1 hour roundtable on cosmopolitanism. We have 3 very distinguished speakers from a range of fields and locations, and I will try to introduce them appropriately and properly. Each speaker will get 10 to 12 minutes, more or less, we said, to present their take on cosmopolitanism. Then we'll have questions either from me as a discussant, Amir, or from the active and engaged audience. I will give the speakers in the order I receive them, because I know Ephraim likes order and not cosmopolitan order. Our first speaker is Guido Hausmann, or Professor Guido Hausmann of the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies. Those of you who know late Imperial Russian history know his work on universities, on civil society, on the public sphere. He is published widely and he's widely cited, and he is certainly a renowned expert on this period, and in particular Odessa. The second speaker is our distinguished chair from the previous panel, Professor Amelia Glaser of sunny University of California, San Diego, where I hope that the sun is shining on all of you there. Amelia is an accomplished scholar of Yiddish, Russian, and Ukrainian literature. Her works are long and many. I will only give some of the main ones. Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands, which came out with Northwestern in 2012. And most recently, a book which I shamefully have not yet read, Songs in Dark Times, Yiddish Poetry of Struggles from the Scottsboro to Palestine, Harvard 2020, and several wonderful collections. And our third speaker, let me scroll down in the Google Doc, you'll pardon me, is Abel Polose. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I haven't met everyone yet, so I'm glad to meet you as well, who is a scholar who's written widely on development, and he's in Europe, the former USSR, and Southeast Asia. And he is currently, and I'm going to get this wrong probably, a professor in the Graduate School of Core Ethics and Frontier Societies in Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Japan. So we have a wonderful lineup here. I think we'll just proceed. Each speaker is speaking for about 10 or 12 minutes, and we'll have time later for conversation discussion. Guido, the floor is yours, and then straight to Amelia, and then on to Abel. Please go ahead.
So thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott, for introducing me. I hope everybody can hear me. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I could not attend all panels, but those which I have attended were great, with great papers, and I enjoyed to listen to them very much. I understand that we have a multidisciplinary panel roundtable discussion here, and I was asked to give a kind of to make a statement from a historian's perspective. So I present the view of a historian on cosmopolitanism, and I have prepared a brief initial statement. So for historians, cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitans are not as sharply defined terms like social class or gender. As far as I see it, most historians consider them in a positive light. They tend to reflect on their normative views in philosophy and political thought since the European Enlightenment. One of their basic meaning is acknowledging or overcoming difference in a world of global citizens, which holds even today despite their diminishing appeal due to their association with colonialism and their rootedness in European or Western thinking. And experts of Soviet history are also aware of the anti-Semitic undercurrent accompanying their use in Soviet Stalinist propaganda and ideology. So the recent flourishing of the terms of cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitans in the social sciences opens a critical perspective on the process on term of globalization, including on its history and its contextualized application, for instance, cosmopolitanism in the urban context, generate doubts and hopes about their applicability as analytical historical categories. So is it at all possible to define a city or a group of people in a time period as cosmopolitan? How did and does cosmopolitanism emerge, vanish, and resurface in a society? Can cosmopolitanism be applied to non-elite social groups? Subaltern cosmopolitanism is a recent coined term. The upper class smell of the term generates skepticism as well, and subaltern cosmopolitanism is very hard to explore historically, even if the latter is not considered a mere echo of some kind of middle or upper class cosmopolitanism. So with respect to the work of our research group on Odessa, I would like to highlight 3 points which might help to sharpen both terms from a historian's perspective. First, cosmopolitanism manifested itself very differently in space, time, and social contexts. I would define it above all as a relational and process-oriented category. For Odessa, 2 contexts fostered cosmopolitanism. First, the context of the expanding Russian Empire to the south in the late 18th century, with a founding myth of city which was open to settlement for many different people, promised economic well-being in a stable political context with little interference from the center. This is the general political context of European empire building in the 18th and early 19th century, and Odessa makes part of it. The second, cosmopolitanism in the city around 1900, shaped by social emancipation against increased state integration, was in my view an expression of distancing and political not belonging. It was directed against the state, increasing political repression and Russian nationalism, which found its local repercussions after 1905 in the local university and the city administration. Cosmopolitanism could encompass in this context anti-imperial nationalisms as well. Expressions of cosmopolitanism thus were very different, and the term cosmopolitanism should be used in its plural form as cosmopolitanisms. My second observation is that historians have only recently started to think about the application of the term, which has found so much interest among colleagues of neighboring disciplines in more detail. So to give an example, the trend of transnationalism and the re-evaluation of biographical writing in historical scholarship in the past decades has fostered the interest in so-called transnational lives. The term cosmobility has been coined recently to highlight the agency of actors who were rooted both in transnational social relationships and in particularly localities and networks, emphasizing the necessity to analyze the intentions, capabilities, and opportunities for mobility across geographical and social boundaries. So to become spatially and socially mobile. This use of the concept of cosmopolitanism might be of interest for an analysis of Odessa's cosmopolitans at the beginning of the 20th century. Can this be also of help to distinguish between cosmopolitanisms in Odessa and other cities, and in what regard? And third and last, social anthropologists have recently introduced the term translocality, with a dash of criticism towards the fashionable term cosmopolitanism. Translocality does not stress the European or Western tradition. It has been applied to the global South, to villages and small towns, to non-elite actors, and encompasses many forms of acting and circulations beyond the pale of the local, stressing also its impact on the remaking of the local, which is not a self-contained unit. In this regard, the term translocality overlaps with the term rooted cosmopolitanism, whereas cosmopolitanism usually expresses the rejection of nationalism in a Western context. Can newly coined terms as subaltern cosmopolitanism rival the concept of translocality? As a historian, I have a slight preference for the historical or traditional term, cosmopolitanism, which allows conceptualizations, reconceptualizations, and sharpening by pointing to past usages and meanings, although there are certain limits of this usage. Thank you very much. This is my initial statement.
Oh, it's a wonderful statement, in particular because it's under the time limit. So I'm so delighted, making my job easy. Amelia, you're going up with a PowerPoint. Great, go for it. Amelia, please.
Yes, I am just getting my screen oriented for myself. All right. Thank you so much. I've so enjoyed the presentations today, and my apologies that I've had to miss many of them this week. I had a family emergency come up, but I hope to be able to catch up. So what I want to introduce to this conversation is the question of how past ideas of Odessa cosmopolitanism have presented challenges to Ukraine's efforts to define a post-Soviet civic identity that's independent from Russia. And the contemporary poet, who you see on the slide here, Boris Khersonsky, is a psychotherapist by training who's become one of Ukraine's best-known Russian language poets. And he's taken an increasingly critical view of Odessa's literary icons, although ironically we see him here against the backdrop of his collection of actual Orthodox icons. Khersonsky is a provocative writer who has done his best to needle those on all sides. So I want to just take this 2010 poem that Khersonsky wrote, dedicated to, actually I wrote 2011 because that was the first publication I found, dedicated to Isaac Babel. And here he bypasses Babel's beloved writing to focus on his tragic collaboration with the Soviet regime. I'll just read it in my rather clunky English translation. Comrade Isaac Babel writes the history of the city O, the Great Pearl by the Black Sea. They'll make a movie from this text. Comrade Babel exalts Comrade Stalin, although they will shoot Babel completely and eternally. So Khersonsky's rejection of Babel's place in Odessa mythology helps to explain a cultural divide in Ukraine that's become particularly apparent in the aftermath of the Euromaidan protests of 2013-14, which led to the ouster of then President Yanukovych over his corruption and rejection of closer ties to the European Union. And this divide deepened, of course, during the ongoing war in Donbass between Ukraine and Russian-backed separatists. Odessa experienced its own painful schism on May 2nd, 2014, when conflicts between pro-Russian and pro-Kiev demonstrators led to the death of over 40 people, most of them supporters of Russia, in a fire at the Trade House Union. So I read Khersonsky's writings about Babel in particular as an example of what Walter Mignolo has called critical cosmopolitanism. Mignolo discusses the supposedly cosmopolitan narratives that position themselves as either managerial or emancipatory, but are in actuality often, quote, oblivious to the saying of the people that are supposed to be emancipated. Mignolo warns against mistaking colonial rhetoric for cosmopolitanism, and he calls attention to the coloniality of power and the colonial difference produced, reproduced, and maintained by global systems. So by questioning the legacy of a beloved Odessa writer, Khersonsky seeks to imagine an Odessa that is no longer beholden to the mixture of Russian imperialism and multinationalism celebrated in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia under the name of internationalism. Well, in April of 2019, Khersonsky gave an interview with the poet Yakovleva for the online platform Shoizdat, and he commented, "The myth of the Odessa criminal, which provided much needed relief in the work of Babel and Bagri." He commented the quote that's on the board. I took it off of my slide. "If you admit that Odessa is more than a city, that it's a country, then the capital, the cultural capital of this country is and will be Moscow. The language of Odessa will be twisted in the image of Yiddish Russian. The Bible will be Babel's Odessa stories, and the official anthem is 'Two crooks broke from the Odessa slammer.'" So the myth of the Odessa criminal, which provided much needed relief in the work of Babel and Bagritsky and others, helps to engender a Soviet counterculture. But at the same time, the myth of an Odessa underworld eventually entered Soviet mainstream literature. And in this interview, Khersonsky implies that Odessa, burdened by its place in Russian history as a humorous city and even as a hero city, has been unable to move beyond its Soviet roles as a memorial city. Well, since the Euromaidan protests and the beginning of the war in Donbass, scholars have observed a change in the way that Ukrainian identity is constructed. According to Volodymyr Kulik, a political scientist, in a 2017 survey, more people self-identified as Ukrainian citizens, and this included both Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, than they had in 2012 or 2014. Karina Karastelina has corroborated with this finding. She similarly observed the rise since 2014 of a civic multicultural narrative that has replaced both a Ukrainian nationalist narrative and the Soviet-influenced neo-imperialist narrative, which relies on collective consciousness. Khersonsky, who aligns himself with this civic vision of Ukrainian identity, is resisting a complex post-Soviet constellation of power, which includes simultaneously the Soviet-style cultural imperialism of Russia and the Ukrainian post-Soviet oligarchy. Well, iconoclasm is part of Khersonsky's literary self-identity. In one poem, he writes proudly of the many apparent contradictions in his identity, from his dual allegiances to Russian and Ukrainian to his Christian Jewish faith. He writes here in the second stanza, "I once was baptized, so persecute me, Jews, but I remained a Jew in the depths of Christian thought." And the poem ends with this provocation, "Я живу в Одессе, убито мене Одесситы," right? I live in Odessa, but kill me, Odessans. Khersonsky's pride in these seeming inconsistencies can be read as a manifesto on his rejection of monolithic and monoethnic ideas. Well, if, as Khersonsky has suggested, 21st century Odessa is still oriented toward Moscow as a source of culture and comedy, this relationship reinforces the idea that 21st century Russia extends beyond its borders and undermines Ukraine's efforts to define itself as multi-ethnic. Tanya Richardson has described Ukraine's struggle against Russia's post-Soviet claim to regional dominance masquerading as internationalism. She writes, "The claims that Odessa is internationalist and not Ukrainian can be understood when considered in relation to shifting political spaces, demographic and ideological relationships between country and city, and the politics of generating and defining high and low culture." So Odessa did not clearly cease to be cosmopolitan in the Soviet period. Rather, its cosmopolitanism was reconfigured into stories that supported a Soviet version of communist internationalism, reworking an imperialist idea as the friendship of Soviet peoples. In post-Soviet Russian rhetoric, the term international has become shorthand in some cases for pro-Russian, feeding a Kremlin-fueled idea that the former Soviet states, in their break with Moscow, have become dangerously nationalist. Well, in the years since the Euromaidan, Khersonsky has attacked Soviet Odessa myths much more directly. His 2017 satirical novella Zapiski Bezumca, Notes of a Madman, which appears in Odesskaya Intelligentsia, portrays an anthropomorphic Odessa intelligentsia, who is a lady who attempts to appear young with a tendency to put on weight, passionate with natural curls. Her mother is Odessa, her father is unknown because mama is such a ellipsis. Odessa intelligentsia herself believes her dad may be Isaac Babin, who confessed to everything before he was shot. And he goes on to say at many points in this novella, "I fell madly in love with the Odessa intelligentsia." She torments the narrator. She alternately admonishes him for rejecting Odessa's internationalist history and branding him with anti-Semitic stereotypes. But the narrator continues to reiterate his love for the Odessa intelligentsia. Well, Khersonsky, like his narrator in Notes of a Madman, is an outlier in the largely pro-Russian Odessa artistic culture. Another exception is the artist Alexander Roitburt, who you see here. Roitburt is the director of the Modern Art Museum in Odessa, and he makes a couple of fictionalized cameos in Khersonsky's novella, which I just cited. He actually even wrote a preface to the book in which he describes Khersonsky's anamnesis, the obsessive recollection of past memories, or a patient's account of their own medical history. And here's just a quote from that intro. Odessa poets are supposed to glorify Odessa and Odessans. Khersonsky examines the city and its residents as a doctor, discovering ulcers penetrating the depths of the unconscious, diagnosing difficult and often incurable diseases. Well, Khersonsky's rejection of Odessa's Soviet-centered culture is more comprehensible in light of Roitburt's visual art. Roitburt similarly desacralizes Odessa's nostalgia in his own work. His cycle, The Metaphysics of Myth, and you see one example on this slide, depicts the famous city landmarks invaded by sea creatures. The architecture of the Odessa Pier, Pushkin's bust, the train station, and so forth are underwater. The statue of the Duc de Richelieu, which you see here, this is the statue of Pushkin, but in other cases you have the statue of the Duc de Richelieu, which is covered in snails. And here you have Pushkin being invaded by an alligator. Odessa in Roitburt's series has been metaphysically invaded. Its mythical status has been made irrelevant and ridiculous by these swamp monsters. In this cycle, the slowly eroding city yields to creatures and darkness. Khersonsky, in fact, includes several of these images in his book, which the Notes of the Madman appears in, and the book is titled Odesska Intelligentia. Well, what these rather harsh critiques of Odessa's cultural legacy help us to understand is the incompatibility of the Odessa myth with the country's attempt to reinvent itself. In a 2016 poem, Khersonsky writes, "In the world, there's only Odessa, but Odessa isn't the same. Her forms are blurred and her color is faded." And here Khersonsky paints a picture of an Odessa that's been left behind, a victim of a failed Soviet internationalist project that, as Khersonsky presents it, has been repurposed as Russian cultural imperialism, often anachronistically masquerading as Soviet-style internationalism. Well, to some extent, Khersonsky's anti-Odessa irony is part of the tradition that he's resisting. Babil, after all, began his 1916 essay Odessa with the line, "Odessa очень skverny город," right? Odessa is a terrible city. Khersonsky's quarrel, after all, isn't really with the writer that he once loved, but with the national supremacy and neo-imperialism that encroached upon literary freedom by the late 1920s, co-opting even a shrewd critique of Soviet power structures like Babil's for a memorial to cosmopolitanism. For Khersonsky, the nostalgic celebration of Soviet Odessa culture, even one that recognizes the city's historical multiculturalism and the wartime sacrifices of Odessa's Soviet residents, is a threat to a still nascent, independent Ukrainian state. I will go ahead and stop there. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Amelia, for so much great material and a lot of great ideas and questions. Abel, I'm nearsighted or farsighted or Zoom-sighted. It's been a long week. Abel, are you on the screen with us? I don't see him. Anyone else maybe see him? Mira?
I don't see him.
Great.
No,
okay,
but
so
he was in the room, so
yeah. I'm going to make a few comments and open the floor to questions. So first of all, as has been said in other sessions, those who have questions, I think you can just send them to the general chat. If you want to send them to me personally as a direct question, that's also great. I think we've had two wonderful presentations here by Guido and Amelia from very different perspectives, very different disciplinary perspectives, which has raised a lot of key questions about the past 3 or 4 days, and also about the entire project. Guido picked up on a few questions I sent out by email earlier today, or maybe a few days ago. But I guess I want to start with a question, actually, if you'll allow me, friends, to Mira and to Ephraim, if I may. And we'll bring them into the conversation solely because we have a little bit of extra time because Abel has some technical difficulties, perhaps, which he alluded to. So in light of our wonderful conversations over the past 3.5 days. And I too have not been able to attend all of them, but those I have heard have been great. And today's comments by Amelia and Guido, and in the earlier panel by Bob and others. Cosmopolitanism, Odessa. Is it helping us, Ephraim and Mira, understand Odessa? Are we falling prey to the myth of Odessa as a cosmopolitan city that so many speakers have tried to expose as kind of historical myth? How do you think about, or has your thinking about Odessa as a cosmopolitan environment or city changed since you put together this proposal and group and conference and book, even as I understand? And would you do, or are you sticking to your guns and saying that cosmopolitanism is the best way to view Odessa? So really in this closed Zoom room between 15 or 20 of us, what do we gain and what do we lose by looking at Odessa through its own myth? Ephraim, you want to take the first bat at that, and then we'll move over to Mira, or anyone else? Obviously, Brian or Bob or Ilya or any other speakers are welcome to join. And that's my first question. Are we doing ourselves a service or disservice by playing into the myth of Odessa as a cosmopolitan environment?
Okay, I actually would rather hear the members of the round table respond to that first, but
okay. I wanted to give them a break because they give such great papers.
I might come back to it later, but I just want to say for the record that the last 40 years I've been fighting this idea that the Odessa myth is old Odessa, as Tetyana calls it, old Odessa, which is Jewish Odessa. And I've been trying to do that in my work, and I'm not sure if anyone's listening out there, but I think this conference so far has vindicated my belief that we do need to sort out history, especially cultural and social history, from the myth. The myth is interesting in itself, and Joachim Schlur has done some very nice things with that, but it's not Odessa as it was. And the Odessa myth goes back to the 19th century, and as I said in my paper, Barber himself was very consciously appropriating and adapting that myth for his own purposes in the Soviet period, but it's still a myth, and therefore I think one of the objectives of the conference, which I think very modest, I think we have achieved, is to do exactly that, to sort out the historical record of Odessa cosmopolitanism, or as Guido pointed out, cosmopolitanisms in the plural, from the mythical or collective memory, which is often post-memory or tertiary memory in the present day.
Great. Mira, you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah,
your thoughts? That'd be great.
Yeah, of course. I wouldn't take cosmopolitanism as normatively as it has been used in Odessa and self-description. I would really take it as a term that has a complex history of overlaying and sometimes contradicting notions. And if you take them in layers and look through them as lenses on the material of the turn of the century in the early 20th century, I really think that you do see something different and something new. And you don't just reproduce a sugar-coated myth of Odessa being a harbor of the friendship of the people, which it became in the late Soviet myth-making. So what I really think is helpful, that we take notions about culturally valuable or culturally active involvement with other ethnic groups or national group, other religious groups, in their layeredness, also including what Guido mentioned, translocality, for instance. Then you start seeing how cultural life in Odessa really was a result of large-scale and small-scale interaction across ethnic lines. And one thing that became clear to me in the course of our work in our group, but also during this conference, is that we really have to look closer at the Ukrainian constituent of this entire narrative and of the cultural sphere, because then we really get to see something that has never been addressed in at least not in the research that I know about Odessa as cosmopolitan place. Thanks.
Okay. I now see perhaps that Abel has returned and is technologically capable and back with us. Abel, if you're back with us, you can unmute your mic, as we say these days. We'd love to hear your thoughts about cosmopolitanism, please. Well, while you're working with that, I see a question has come in, perhaps. Perhaps Amelia or Guido would like to address a question I raised earlier until Abel gets back online, and then we'll go down the line to questions. So I see Amelia has a hand raised.
I'll be happy to jump in because I think it's a wonderful question. I think it's a really nice way to round out the discussions that we've been having. I think it's important to bear in mind while we talk about the history of a city, that the city is still living and changing. And I'm especially grateful to Vera Skvirskaya, who's here, for her work on contemporary Odessa, because that helps to keep in mind where Odessa is now. I also think that myth is part of history, that the intellectual history of a city has informed every writer that we're talking about. Writers are always struggling with the past. Brian Horowitz has written about Jabotinsky's struggles with the Russian literary influences, his attempts to reject them in some cases. Babel attempted to reject various ideas of the past and even to some extent rejected his Soviet present. But what I find really interesting is how contemporary writers are grappling with this Odessa myth, because they're dealing both with the Odessa myth and with the contemporary Odessa. And Kherssonsky does it in a particularly aggressive way, but I see other contemporary writers in Odessa also playing with the myth, whether they're capitalizing on it or trying to move outside of it.
Okay. Guido, would you like to jump in, please? That'd be wonderful.
Just I think that we historians probably should not, won't deconstruct the cosmopolitanism myth of Odessa. But what we can do is just to sharpen the term, the concept, and to look closer to the context and get a clearer idea what we can do with cosmopolitanism and what is in Odessa really, what is reality, what is myth, how they were interrelated. So I think we can do our work in conceptualizing the term and the concept, and in clarifying some histories of Odessa in the 19th and 20th century.
So I see the disciplinary divides continue among us, which is wonderful. Abel, are you able to hear? Can you hear me? Would you like to jump in? Great. Well, you still have 10 minutes, or maybe even 12, according to original discussion. So please, we'd be happy to hear your thoughts about cosmopolitanism. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's going to be 12 minutes because the connection is loud, so I'm sorry for the technical. What I'm hearing, I was hearing that, as much as I was able to hear the interesting presentation, I just going to present a slightly different kind of approach, a slightly different perspective, because what I know about this is extremely empirical, having lived there and actually having written my PhD years ago about this. So the point was, in a sense, it's going to be, it's a bit subjective, but at the same time, it's also what I was trying to kind of extrapolate from what I was seeing. Because being in Odessa has been really an amazing experience in the sense that you could feel Ukraine, and I was feeling that I was there at the time when Ukraine was trying to impose kind of Ukrainian identity. So I was trying to feel this kind of the tension between the Ukrainian identity was kind of imposed or tried to be imposed by the center state, and the way Odessa was reacting to that. So my idea was, my starting question was, what happens when you have a city which has been very, very kind of not only cosmopolitan, but it's been cosmopolitan in the sense that it's been kind of accepting everyone, and then at some point you have a Ukrainian identity which is overimposed in that respect, and then and so that was the starting point of my research. And by doing this, I went through, I was looking for a place where I could kind of feel this kind of multi-ethnic, multinational, multicultural identity. And those places, I went from the Korean church to the religious institutions, the the old believers kind of places and so on. And then I was trying to see also the surroundings of the city, and all this was very. I mean, I didn't never use the word cosmopolitan, but what I was trying to understand was how so many kind of cultural imprints would come together and just live kind of quietly and peacefully to some respect in the same place. This has been a bit kind of questioned about the fact when I mean during the Euromaidan and in the following years, because then we have tension allegedly between Russian speakers and the rest. But what I've seen also when I returned to the city a few months ago was that still you have this idea that, I mean, he doesn't really, I mean, it's a bit more romanticized, but they don't really care who people are. And then you have many different kind of cultures and many different kind of approaches that come together, and they have just a way of existing, which is many sense unique, and which is also the reason why I ended up with maybe still in this. When I went there, like how it's possible that so many different things come together in a sense that kind of sounds harmonious. Now, I know that I'm romanticized a bit because if you look at history and all the pogroms and all the whatever has happened, I mean, there's been tension, it's been kind of, I mean, it's a constant in the city, and that's also quite common to places all over the world. Whenever you have, I mean, different ethnicity, at some point somebody will wake up and say, well, those people are the bad ones, so let's try to punish them or try to get rid of them. And then you come back to a peaceful period of some kind of several years, and then, I mean, it goes up and down. But what I was kind of, in my work, what I was looking at, I mean, I was looking at the way some institutions have remained, so like the bazaar, and the idea of, I mean, the way the bazaars have evolved kind of inside the city, outside the city, and kind of becoming very important. But also, and perhaps this is where the tensions were felt, the linguistic policies, where you have on the one hand the Ukrainian state saying, oh, you should speak Ukrainian, and then you listen like, yeah, of course we have to speak Ukrainian, but in the end, the compliance was relatively low, in the sense that when I was doing my research, like even schools, when they would say, even I was comparing kind of elite schools, like, and kind of more standard schools, and I was assuming that elite schools would be more kind of prone to comply to comply with the instructions that they had with national instructions, whereas kind of other schools had less pressure. So I was going to kind of the elite schools. If they get more money, if they get more attention, of course they're going to be under higher pressure to comply.
Abel,
yeah,
I'm horribly sorry, but I think we're having trouble hearing you. So either speak differently, or we're going to have to move. We're going to have to move back to the general discussion. I'm not sure everyone can hear you. I've been getting some comments in the chat. If you can maybe sum up in a minute and try to speak a bit more clearly, because the connection isn't great, that would be wonderful. And I think we'll go back to the general discussion. I'm horribly sorry. It's just that all of our love for cosmopolitanism is not always working in our favor. So perhaps you could sum up clearly, and then we'll go to general discussion, and maybe, I don't know, climb to the top of the building you're in. I don't know, get better reception. I don't know.
No, it's okay. If you cannot hear me, I'll just stop here, because I mean, it makes no sense to make stuff. So just go with discussion.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. I so wanted to hear all the papers. I think one of the point is, it raises up a thing, something we need to keep in mind, is that many of us, and I don't know everybody on the screen, but some people on the screen, have lived rather cosmopolitan lives, growing up in one city, studying another, moving to a third country, moving on to a fourth or fifth country. And this is what we're experiencing right now. I know Abel is perhaps now in Japan and has moved all over. So we have here a few questions. The first question, wait, let me get back to my chat, is from, no, I had a question from Marina. Where did it go? Here, Marina, you're still on? Yeah, Marina's now in London. You want to read your own question or should I read it? I don't really care. Why don't you read it?
Hi, sorry, my question was for Amelia. I wanted to understand how popular Khersonsky is in Odessa in your perspective, and who reads him, who follows him, and what are the readers saying about him?
And just in a question of time, Amelia, I'm going to ask Brian if he can ask one of his questions. Brian, would you like to ask your question now, and we'll just gather 2 questions and then go on? Is that cool, Brian? Unmute yourself, young man.
Yes. I have one question for Amelia and maybe for Guido as well. But my question for Amelia is so when empires fall, the empire's outposts need to reinvent themselves. They're palimpsest, conflicted places. I'm just wondered if we could agree that Odessa can be one of those conflicted places, remain conflicted, as well as the second part of that question is, what about, I didn't get a sense in your paper, I mean, you could elaborate about the Jewish dimension. Is there a talk about Jewish absence, or does Jewish always mean Russian? And is the Jewish absence something like the Horowitz has, not me, has written about Chernovitz, for instance? And then to Guido, let's see if I can remember the question that was just, I think, does Russian always mean something negative? Russian cosmopolitan, for many of us, we live in this three dimensions, or two. Russian literature, Russian culture, Russian 1905, without the violence. It's Russian as a hope, Russian as a great cosmopolitan world that brought the peripheries into Western culture, or Russian, Stalinism. So can Russian be something positive for the cosmopolitan among us?
Okay, thanks so much for the questions. Please, Amelia, and then Guido, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for both of these questions. How popular is Khersonsky? That's a really important question. Not a lot in Odessa. He's not popular in Odessa. He's read in Kiev. He's read by those who are, Yakovleva did this interview with him for Shoysdat, which is a Ukrainian platform. And you can see this in his own transformation from Russian to Ukrainian. Most of his work is still in Russian, but he is slowly shifting over to Ukrainian language writing because that's who his audience is now. I think that's part of the reason. He's worked with Mariana Kianovska, who's helped to edit his work in Ukrainian, sometimes to translate his work. Serhiy Zhadan has helped him to translate his work into Ukrainian. So his base, his readers are not in Odessa. His friends in Odessa are few and far between. Roitbard is an old friend. The two of them clearly are sort of twins in a certain way. And Roitbard also was thrown out of his post as director briefly because of his support of the Maidan. It's one of these. He represents the majority if you look at the capital of Ukraine, but definitely a minority in his own city. And he's very aware of this role. And he's in all sorts of fights with the Odessa literary community, with the Mirovoy Klub Odessitov, and he doesn't like any of them, and they don't like him. So that's important to recognize. To respond to Brian's question, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Odessa is conflicted. It's deeply conflicted, and yet it's sort of not conflicted. It's sort of just a Russian city in a certain way. And then you have these voices like Khersonsky's that are exceptions. What I do see, and I wish I could just go and live in Odessa for a while and watch this take place. But from brief trips, is that you see a younger Odessa crowd that's starting to welcome more connections to other cities in Ukraine. And I think the conflict is probably going to grow deeper. That's my prediction, but I'm not supposed to make predictions. I'm, a literature scholar, a literary historian. But it's deeply conflicted. And I think that's okay. I think that is what makes it, as you're saying, cosmopolitan to a certain extent. As for the Jewish dimension, Khersonsky has written about a Jewish past. He's written some of his early works that made him popular are like Semyenny Archiv, which is a really wonderful cycle about his family Jewish past, really digging in and trying to find his connection to various rabbis in the pre-Soviet period, and to write about Yiddish, as Yiddish was spoken in parts of his family all around Ukraine, what is now Ukraine. And he, I would say, particularly until recent years, was looking for national alternatives to this Soviet internationalism. So he was looking for sort of Jewish national alternatives as a way of finding something that was Jewish beyond the Russian. And, he looks for Ukrainian alternatives. Although now he's also become a little bit critical in some cases of Ukrainian nationalism. So it's a very, he likes to provoke. But absolutely. And, his writing is, it's not uniformly amazing, but he has some very rich work that does draw on that Jewish past.
Well, I understand that this was a very general question about this Russian always negative. I'm living in my view, in a very Russophile society. Germany is very Russophile, and probably not at the moment and not in the past years. But as soon as there will be major changes in Russia, I think this kind of Russophile sentiment in German society will resurface pretty soon. So I have no doubts about this. But I'm not sure, is this what you wanted to know from my side?
Maybe I see Mira would also like to comment on this. So please go ahead, Mira. Jump
in. Yeah, it depends on whether there's something positive about the Russian constitution. I think this can easily be brought together with the cosmopolitanism question. This is what drives part of my research, understanding Russian culture differently. And to me, cosmopolitanism is a conceptual tool that allows me to see those things that are going on in at least late imperial and also Soviet literary history that make us look at Russian culture differently, more to make clearer what constituents there are and what cultural interactions there were with the non-Russians. And this to me is appealing because it makes the Russian look differently, and also to understand Russian imperial discourse better because of making clear just how much Russian culture that understands itself as one of the richest world cultures in history profited from intercultural and transcultural contact.
I think something we might also want to think about is this slippery connection, or this unclear connection between cosmopolitanism and imperialism, or the empire, and the way empires slip into the cosmopolitan, whether it's the Russian Empire or the American Empire or whatever empire you have. Are there other questions out there from our learned and engaged and brilliant audience members?
I have a short question,
please.
For Amelia, maybe, and also for listening to you, I thought about maybe multi-layered perception of Russian culture, at the example of Germany and maybe Odessa or post-Soviet world, because if it's about the perception of Russian culture, even in a Russophile society like the German one, it's about Dostoevsky, about Navalny, and maybe to some extent Gergiev in München. So it's what can be described as a high culture, and if it's about post-Soviet world and Odessa as an example of it, it's so broad. It's KVN, it's Zhvanetsky, it's Gorodok, and the whole many other realms of the pop culture. It's Pugachev, it's Rataro talking about Moldova connection and so on. And I would even say several generation mosaic of perceptions, or evolution goes on like on one level, perceiving the other.
Okay. Anybody other want to respond to that or pick up with another question out there?
You were going in and out a little bit, but so I don't think I caught all of your question, but can I just sort of rephrase what I think I heard you asking? And that is that when we talk
that's what we always do.
Yeah, when we talk about So let me try to reframe. When we talk about Russian culture and the appreciation of Russian culture from the outside, which Russian culture are we talking about? Sort of high culture? Are we talking about more popular culture? And it's, then of course you have to figure out what falls into what category. But I think that's really interesting. I think that the culture that Khersonsky is trying to reject is both, but it's largely popular culture around Odessa, the culture that has fit Odessa into a particular box within Russian high culture and then international understanding of Odessa. And his relationship to Zhvanietsky, who you mentioned, is kind of complicated. He's been very critical of Zhvanietsky as sort of the mouthpiece for Odessa, but Zhvanietsky moved to Moscow, so why does he get to be the mouthpiece for Odessa? And then in the middle of, I was writing this article about it, Zhvanietsky died. And Khersonsky started to write these things that were like these kind of loving memorials to Zhvanietsky. So it became clear that actually he sort of owed this debt to Zhvanietsky as as a sort of complex voice around Odessa, who did certainly identify as an Odessite who made Odessa proud, although he also helped to put it into a box. So his own relationship to Zhvanietsky is maybe similar to his relationship to Babil, even though maybe they'd fit in different high-low categories.
Guido, would you like to comment on this last question, or are you going to pass? You're going to pass, great. So maybe we have time for one or two more questions, if there are from audience members, participants, not really audience, but seminar participants. No? If not, I will pass the mic back to our fearless leaders, Ephraim and Miria. No more questions? Okay.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay, please.
And let me thank our speakers and our audience and discussers and the chair for a wonderful roundtable. I want to clap my yellow hands. Thanks a lot. And perhaps I will just make a very few concluding remarks. I'm pretty sure that Ephraim will also have to say a couple of words. I think we really had a wonderful conference, even though I have to admit that I was so disappointed that we couldn't meet in person and that we really had to cut our program short to such an extent that we really lost a lot. But I think we can still be proud of what we managed to rescue. And I want to thank all the speakers and chairs and the engaged discussing audience for a wonderful time. I think we also found some questions that really have been or remained open, or even fields that have been opened up out of the many interesting discussions of today. This entire question of a comparative view of the Black Sea region is and remains something that seems to be a really rich field also for future discussions to me. But we also managed, I think, to deepen and open up questions that have been lingering in the field for a longer period already. So from my side, I really have the impression that we rounded up our workshop with this conference on the one hand and managed to have new and open and exciting questions for further discussions. And I sincerely hope that we will be able to carry this discussion into different media and maybe face-to-face communication in the nearer or further future. And yeah, I guess this is it from my side. Many thanks also to the Jerusalem Institute for hosting us and for supporting us with the entire organization of this event. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Miria. You've been absolutely wonderful all along from the time we met briefly in Jerusalem with the research group came together. And you know, I was taught by my history teacher at school that you never ever ask the question if. Right? If is a banned word in history. That hasn't stopped a lot of historians recently asking if. So I want to say, if we had been able to meet and have this conference in Jerusalem, we can't ask that question. We can only say that thank God for Zoom, which has brought us together, notwithstanding all the circumstances and technical problems that have almost seemed to have defeated us, but we never allowed to defeat us. So I would very much like to say thank you to everyone, all the participants, and I hope very much that we will be able to continue this discussion somehow in some form. I would just like to give a promo for the book that will appear with Academic Studies Press in the next year or so, which is a collection of essays by the members of the research group, most of whom are here with us today. We've had just a little glimpse of some of the things that we are saying in the book, but I think, as Amelia pointed out, our perspective of cosmopolitanism has to be much more open and flexible, not just to see Odessa as a multi-ethnic city that's before the revolution managed to produce a remarkable output of literary modernism, but also a city that existed in a historical and geopolitical context. And I was very glad that we were able to, at least in one session, open up that perspective of the Black Sea, Odessa and its cultural and trade contacts with the Caucasus and further east, of course. I just mentioned that Barbara did spend 1 year, or almost a year, in Georgia, in Tbilisi in particular, and also in Baku, as a journalist. I don't think what he produced was absolutely brilliant or outstanding, but yes, there's always been a cultural exchange between Odessa and the Caucasus and the Black Sea. The Black Sea historically brought civilization from east to the west through commercial and cultural context. So we need to decide what perspective we're looking at. So once again, thank you everyone, and thank you to the technical support, Shai Smith, who has silently been making sure things actually work and people are able to enter the meeting. Thank you to Amelia Gil and Ilana Gudkin as well as Madar for their ongoing efforts to make this conference happen. And I hope that you'll all bring away from the conference something useful, and the main thing is to keep in good health. We're going to end with a musical finale again from the March 2018 concert, Odessa Mama Jewish Landscapes of Odessa, and we cannot leave Odessa without hearing Cantor Pinchas Minkowski and his celebrated rendering of Song of Ascents from the Psalms, Shir HaMa'alot, which many Jewish families sing on Shabbat and other days to thank God. And we really do need to be thankful that we are alive and well and we're able to meet. Let's look at it positively, not what we couldn't do, but what we could do. And this rendering was never, what Minkowski never recorded his music, but it was very much part of the Jewish revival of the early 20th century in Odessa, and very much part of what Odessa means historically in Jewish and cosmopolitan culture. Minkowski was also an opera critic who did not only sing in the synagogue, but he never recorded his music. And the very famous American cantor, Joseph Rosenblatt, sang this version, and everyone thinks it's his. And unfortunately, I actually was at a concert where someone tried a different version of Shir HaMa'alot. There are many versions nowadays, and said that Minkowski's version was written by some little Jew in a shtetl, and which really upset me, because I thought, well, what's happened is we've forgotten our history. And so, in tribute to Pinchas Minkowski, who lived in Odessa till 1922, when he moved to America. We should finish with his rendition of Sheronot as a vote of thanks for what we've managed to achieve, but also a tribute to a great cantor. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to leave you with the finale of the concert, Odessa Mama. If it will let me, I see. And let's just get to the right screen. Okay, thank you, everyone. We hope to see you in Jerusalem.
Yeah, next year as we have it, right?
Next in Jerusalem.